Hi, good morning, everybody, and welcome to our board workshop series number 3, which is aligning your bylaws for how you function today. And I'm really pleased to be able to have joining me today Ron Christaldi, who's an attorney and partner with Shoemaker Kendrick, but also the president of CEO and Shoemaker Advisors of Florida. Good morning, Ron. How are you?
Good morning, everybody. I am awesome today, particularly after the Bolts Stanley Cup victory last night, and ready to go here.
So just a few things before we get started. Right now I have everybody on mute, but I will be unmuting you soon, so then you could be self-muted. If you have any particular questions that maybe you don't want to forget, please feel free to put them in the question box. We will be having a pause every 15 minutes or so to make sure that you have the opportunity to either be heard, or if it is something that you wish for us to broach in a more confidential way, we are happy to do that from the question perspective. So we're going to just go ahead and get started, share a little bit about what we do. It's really exciting because I get the opportunity to work with Ron on a variety of things when it comes to different client work. And this is one area where we actually work really well with in terms of finding out how we can help organizations either enhance their bylaws, keep them current, up to date. And I will say that it always gives me great comfort working with an attorney when we're working on bylaws together, so that we can make sure that we're really achieving what the organization is doing at the time. So if this is your first time joining us, I wanted to share a little bit just about Catalyst Consulting Services. We are basically covering the Southeast United States, although we do have some clients now out west that have joined us this year. And we really focus on facilitating change for your organization, primarily nonprofit organizations. And we focus on executive searches, fundraising, training, and organizational management. We also have some support services that we provide through our collaborative partners, whether you need executive coaching at the C-suite level, marketing and advertising, grant writing, database administration, background checks and drug screening, or even virtual events. If you are in the position of shifting some of your special events to virtual, we can help with that as well. We are a small company, but mighty. We do raise funds, as one of our facets is fundraising. And since we were formed, we've raised over $75 million for our organization, primarily through capital campaigns for organizations and their annual giving campaigns. We also have a client list of about 75 nonprofits that we've worked with since 2014 that we can say that we have positively changed for the better. And please feel free to review any of those testimonials or a client list on our website. We are happy to share that. We also really feel strongly that we want to give back in terms of our time. And so myself and our collaborative partners donate over 400 hours to our nonprofits that either are our partners or those that we personally have a tie to. And we also feel a responsibility to give back as well. And so to date, we've given over $40,000 in corporate support back to the community to sponsor initiatives that we feel can strengthen the infrastructure and help our clients to really move forward and enhance their mission. So I'd love the opportunity for Ron to tell you a little bit about Shoemaker as well. Ron?
Sure, thank you, Michelle. So Shoemaker Kendrick is the largest law firm in the 8-county region comprising Tampa Bay. We were founded in 1925. We have offices in 5 states: Ohio, Michigan, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Florida. We are a full-service law firm. We do many things, but including working on things like bylaws and corporate governance, executive compensation, all types of contracting. We have a subsidiary called Shoemaker Advisors, which is a public affairs and lobbying firm that also provides business-to-business type services. And we do represent many not-for-profits in the legal community, big and small. Our largest is about a $1.2 billion a year not-for-profit, and we represent very small grassroots not-for-profits as well, full on the spectrum. And for those of you who don't know me personally, I've got a business law practice. I serve on a number of boards currently. I serve on the New College Board of Trustees. I serve on the Tampa Museum of Art Board. I serve on the Ybor City Development Corporation Board and the Friends of the Riverwalk Board, and I'm a past chair of the Greater Tampa Chamber of Commerce. Thanks, Michelle.
Absolutely. So one of the things we want to talk a little bit about today is specifically how your bylaws may look in Florida. We do have some organizations that have joined us today that obviously are housed in Florida, but their reach might go beyond the state of Florida. But we definitely wanted to kick it off with things that are specific if you're operating out of Florida. So one of the resources I wanted to share with you today, if you have the opportunity, is to check out this Florida Not-for-Profit Corporation Act booklet. It's actually provided by our, I would say, entity that really oversees those nonprofits that are registering to become a nonprofit, if there's any changes that need to be made to your bylaw, and that's the Florida Department of State's Division of Corporations. So we also put their phone number there. Of course, you know, if you want to reach out to Ron and I, we can also answer questions, but wanted to make sure you're aware of this resource. Most likely you are having filings and communication with the Florida Department of State's Division of Corporations throughout the year. So there are some specific things that we'll be pointing out today as it pertains to the state of Florida, but if there's other states that you might have a question about, we'll try to answer that, or we'll definitely get the answer back to you. We're fortunate that Shoemaker operates in a variety of other states and can get us answers if there's something specific outside of the state. So for those of you that are either working with organizations or have filed in the state of Florida, just wanted to share some minimum requirements. Of course, maybe you've had a chance recently to look at your bylaws or articles of incorporation, but in the state of Florida, your articles of incorporations are filed with the Secretary of State. Probably at the same time you're working on your bylaws. Usually your bylaws and your articles are usually filed at the same time or roughly around the same time. And so we're going to dig really deep today in some of those requirements, if you will, or things for you to consider. But some of the minimum requirements is a minimum of 3 board members upon formation of your nonprofit. So that is something to consider. After your articles of incorporation have been filed with the Secretary of State, then the board of directors can approve the bylaws. So a recommendation that I'm sure Ron will get into in a little while is making sure that you have those documents very close and mirror each other in terms of address, some of the formation, if you will, so that once they've been approved, your articles of incorporation, you know, your bylaws will follow behind. And then just something to consider in our Florida statutes that I think is really important, wanted to make sure that you're aware is the initial bylaws are adopted by the board. So it is something we're going to get into in terms of if you're going to amend those bylaws or if there's any structural changes to your organization, but your initial bylaws do need to be adopted by the board and signed off by the board. So there may contain some type of provision, as I've shared here, for the regulation and management of those affairs of the corporation, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. The bylaws also must be kept at the principal location. I personally have seen those either kept at the principal location of the nonprofit. I've also seen if they're working with an attorney or legal team, maybe copies housed with the attorney and legal team as well. But making sure that you've got a copy, maybe in these days also having a digital copy housed somewhere that can easily be shared by the governing members of the board of your executive committee. I wanted to also point out, if you have not filed initially, it is $35 to file initially, or roughly that's the price point. We checked on that right before we did this. So it's not necessarily something that's of an expense. It's the fact of the matter that you really want these legal documents to have in there what is needed that aligns with your business in the present day. So one of the reasons why we wanted to have this particular workshop and bring Ron in the loop is that over time, your bylaws will change. They should change, and you shouldn't be scared of that change. There's usually opportunities that will push that change. One could be maybe you're going through strategic planning and you're wanting to maybe look at your mission, your vision, the way that things are enacted through committee structures. You may also be going through forming a partnership or a merger. We were so fortunate to have Ron available a few weeks ago to talk about the differences between that. And we will be releasing that video as well. It's also been released on YouTube, and we'll be happy to share that link with you. So that might be something that's happening within your organization, is some type of partnership or merger. Or maybe there is a change in your organizational structure. So what I mean by that is maybe you've been housed in Florida and you're looking to create either a more regional, national model. And that is something that can also push for change and alignment. So with that, I want to go ahead and hand it over to Ron, and we're going to sort of build layers upon this to share with us the difference between nonprofit versus tax exempt. Ron?
Perfect. Thank you, Michelle. And we thought it was important today at the beginning sort of this a discussion here to make some distinctions, because we're primarily focused on the corporate aspects of a not-for-profit, not the tax-exempt aspects of the not-for-profit. And those mean some different things. And simply because a corporation is organized as a not-for-profit under the state of Florida's laws does not mean that it's exempt from tax. In fact, you could have a taxable not-for-profit. Nonprofit refers to the type of legal entity created under Florida law or the other state of incorporation, and it specifically indicates that there are no shareholders. The primary distinction between a for-profit and a not-for-profit entity is that there are no shareholders that can take dividends out of the company in a not-for-profit setting, as there would be in a for-profit setting. By contrast, tax exemption is a designation granted by the Internal Revenue Service, and it can come in a number of forms. The most common form I think that folks see is the 501c3 designation. But for instance, some organizations like chambers would be a 501c6 organization, having different rules for qualification under the IRS regulations and different operational rules. So it's important to understand, one, what type of tax exemption your entity has, if it does have tax exemption, and two, to understand that some of the things we're talking about today are more on the corporate side, but they might be driven by some of the IRS regulations as well. Typically, when the IRS grants any type of tax exemption, it looks at two tests, one organizational and one operational. And the reason that distinction is important, the organizational component of the IRS test is a function of your governing documents and policies and procedures. So when you send your articles of incorporation and your bylaws to the IRS seeking approval of a tax exemption, they will look to make sure that those documents organizationally are sufficient to meet the IRS requirements, which is why you will see certain things in bylaws of not-for-profits, like a provision that says, for instance, if the corporation ceases to exist, its assets will be distributed to another tax-exempt entity. Those types of provisions are provisions that the IRS will look to grant the tax exemption and ensure that organizationally the corporation is set up in a way that qualifies it, which also begs the question a little bit of the right team to approach things like bylaw revisions. In my opinion, you should have your accountant look at those documents. You should have your lawyer look at those documents, and you should have a strategy consultant, the best of which is Michelle on the webinar here today, look at those documents. What you would not want to do is add or take away from a provision that might be required by the state of Florida or by the IRS without understanding what the ramifications of that could be and potentially jeopardizing either your not-for-profit status or your tax-exempt status. Thanks, Michelle.
Welcome. How about the purpose of the bylaws, Ron?
Yeah, sure. So it's also important to understand where the bylaws fit in the grand scheme of things. The bylaws are part of the governing structure of the organization, along with articles of incorporation, resolutions, and policies. So these terms are used frequently, but they are very distinct and different documents that have very different and distinct roles in the governance of the organization. The articles of incorporation are essentially the equivalent of the constitution of the organization. Those are a public document. They get filed with the Secretary of State in Florida, and they have very high level type provisions like, for instance, how many directors must be on the board of directors, what action might be necessary to dissolve the corporation, those types of things that would be constitutional in nature, but are not very functional. Because you have to make those documents, the articles, a public record, and because they're typically difficult to amend by way of process, you don't want to make the Constitution figuratively easy to amend. You want to make sure it's well thought through. You keep only high-level top-line governance issues in the Articles of Incorporation. By contrast, the bylaws are really the set of laws that govern the operation of the entity. If you think about it in the terms of legal context, you have the United States Constitution, and then you have federal statutes, federal laws. These are a little easier to amend. They're not necessarily public record in that they're not filed with the state of Florida, and they provide more detail, for instance, on what would constitute a quorum at a meeting, what officers there might be in the corporation, a level of detail of how those officers get elected, and so on and so forth. It's important, though, Michelle pointed out earlier, that the bylaws do have to be approved by the board of directors, and they're typically a high standard, either a 2/3 or a 3/4 vote to amend the governing documents of the entity. So you don't want to put things in the bylaws that will be difficult to amend, that you have to change from time to time. As a for instance, you don't want to say our organization is going to have its annual meeting on March the 3rd every year, and then find one year you have to have it on the 4th because a majority of your members are indisposed and unavailable that day. You would have to amend your governing documents in order to change that date. So it would be better in that document to provide yourself flexibility and either say in the first quarter of each year, or ideally at a time set by the board each year. And so the board can determine with some flexibility when the annual meeting is going to be. There's some things that are not of a reoccurring nature that would be handled by the board that are better done by resolution than by bylaw change. So a resolution is a written document that's circulated to the board in advance of a meeting that is approved by the board. And to give you for instance, if you decided that for purposes of a vacancy in a particular officership, you wanted to appoint somebody as an interim, you might create an interim position by resolution for a time-limited period of time and not have to amend your governing documents. As long as the action isn't prohibited by the bylaws, the board generally has the ability to take such actions and can do it through a resolution, and the resolution will expire at some point when the specific action is over, and you don't then have to amend the bylaws. Another easy example is if you're going to establish a line of credit, you might approve the governing documents by resolution, but not necessarily change your governing documents to be so specific as to appropriate a certain type of financing for a period of time. And then lastly, you've got policies and procedures, which really govern the day-to-day operations of the corporation. Those typically, a few of them might be approved by the board of directors. For instance, your conflict of interest policy may be approved by the board of directors, but there may be policies on things like dress code, for instance, for your organization. If you're a service organization and you want your customers to be able to easily identify volunteers and workers, you may have a dress code policy. You would not want to put that in your bylaws or articles of incorporation, because each time you decided to amend it or change it, you'd have to go through the governing document amendment process. What you would do is commend the management of the company to implement policies that might be necessary for the operation of the company, and thereby the senior leadership, the management of the organization, can amend and change those policies on a day-to-day basis or on a month-to-month basis as needed to keep with the up speed with the requirements of the organization. So to sum, the bylaws should be at a high level to deal with governance and process. They're adopted at the first board of directors meeting, and they continue to be amended by the board over the life of the corporation. And they should be revisited and refreshed periodically, but I would suggest that once a year or once every other year cycle, unless there's a specific issue that's come up, is probably frequent enough to amend those documents where the policies and the resolutions can fill in the gaps in between. So I think, Michelle, that takes us to some of the specific provisions. Next slide here.
It does. Before we leave this slide, Ron, I thought maybe we could talk about, when we talk about being revisited and refreshed, what would your suggestions be to those that are joining us today? You know, sometimes it's tasked to a certain committee, governance, or a task force. Could you maybe share in your experience? I'd like for you to share. I can always share too, but you know, who would be wise to serve on a bylaw task force committee, either with legal counsel or a consultant, but who should be part of that so that there's ownership versus the whole board?
Yep. So it's an excellent question. And sometimes it depends on the size of the organization and the size of the organization's board. If you have a 6-person board, you may not have 12 different committees because it's the same folks acting again and again. But typically you would not commend the entire board to go through the process to review. Of course, the full board approves the amended document. Typically you would rely either on a governance committee or the executive committee of the organization. And it's important, it's very important to have, in my opinion, to have a consultant like yourself assist with that, for the reason that the board members are not fully objective, right? So if you're trying to find, for instance, best practice on term limits, the board members who may be rotating off the board in a month or may want somebody else to rotate off the board in a month have a different lens on practically how that should play out based on the ground underneath their feet at the time. But these documents should not be used to resolve a anecdotal issue that the organization is having. They should be used to set long-term policy, and I would commend the board to get objective third-party advice. And then, of course, you want to have counsel look at these documents to, again, make sure they're consistent with the legal requirements and the IRS requirements. I would also suggest the CPA look at them just to be sure. CPA is going to be auditing the organization and helping prepare its 990s, and would want to know that the governing documents are consistent with its activities. So to me, that would be the process. And it certainly comes from the practical experiences of the board. Ultimately, the board makes the decision. A governance or an executive committee would be charged with getting into the details, but based on third-party advice that's objective, that those individuals can take into consideration in determining what's best for the company.
Okay, thank you. And I'm just going to take a quick pause. Thank you for answering that question as it was posed. Are there any questions at this time that anyone would like to share? Okay, then we will move forward. And then if there's anything that comes up again, please feel free to type it in the chat box. This next one, I wanted to talk a little bit about bylaw provisions, and I want to touch on each one, and I think also maybe provide some insight as to their trends that we've seen or are seeing, and then I'd like to take a pause at the end, Ron, and have you chime in as well. I typically find why it works so well working with an attorney. There's the practical, and then there's like, this is what we have to go by. But they should be a fluid document. But there are some things that, as we work with clients, there's a fine line between making sure that you've got some flexibility in them, but making sure also you have some specific guidelines in there. And so in this particular slide, what we wanted to talk about is, you know, they're not necessarily in a particular format, but I would say, particularly having worked with Ron, you know, there are some things that's lined out fairly clearly, whether it be the location, the mission, articulating, you know, who is the membership or defining the membership. So some of these things that you're going to see in here are fairly standard, like the official name of a nonprofit corporation. And so one of the things I wanted to share here is sometimes we work with organizations that there's the nonprofit corporation, and there might then be a foundation or a fundraising arm, which we can talk about as well. And so we have some clients that say, do we need a separate set of bylaws, which I'd love for Ron to chime in at the end about that. But what is the official name of the nonprofit corporation, making sure that this matches any other types of documents, accounting, financial, and so on and so forth, that there's alignment there, because this is the guiding legal document for the organization. The purpose, I sometimes see nonprofits put the mission there, and that's okay. But at the same time, what is the purpose of the organization? Why is it relevant? Why is it there to exist? And then a description of the board of directors and officers. This is something that I see change over time. Some of the smaller nonprofits we work with, Ron alluded to that when he was introducing himself. We've got nonprofits we work with that have a budget of 250,000 to 75 million, right? And so it changes over time. And when they're just getting off the ground, the description of board members or directors and officers might be really small because they haven't figured out the roles yet, which we'll talk about that a little bit, versus maybe what the organization looks like today. And it might have more sophisticated officers of the board. But typically there is a chair, whether it's chairwoman, chairman, whatever you would like to outline there, a vice chair, a treasurer. Sometimes there's an assistant treasurer, a secretary. Sometimes that position exists. It just depends on how the organization is structured. It's probably the one position that I see that may be dealt with, or those duties might be dealt with maybe an executive assistant, but nevertheless, there are still duties for a secretary, if you will. And so from those positions, it could be filled out even more, but those are really sort of the baseline, if you will. And then depending on the organization, whether or not your CEO or executive director might actually be an officer, which I would love for Ron, if you could just make a note and talk about that, because we've worked with organizations where they are a voting member and they're not. And I think that's something that should be considered for those of you that might have a more seasoned organization. The meeting of the members, if any, it might start out very basic. I would just share with you from a full functioning board, what we're seeing is the goal of having 6 board meetings a year and then 6 committee meetings a year. So as that organization grows, their bylaws might change so that as their committees become more active. And so, for example, some of those committees could be executive, the governance or nominating committee, fundraising, finance. Those are usually some of the standard or standing committees, and the rest might be ad hoc or a task force, for example. But a full functioning board, when the organization is more in the growth mode, they typically are pushing a lot of that work down for engagement at the committee level. And what I would say is many of those committees do not have to be stocked full of board members. In fact, they should have a chair that is a board member, but they really should use those committees as a springboard or an opportunity to have some new individuals for where they need to identify that talent to see if it's a good fit. And it might be a great vetting process to then serve on the board. As Ron alluded to, any fiscal information or policies. So for example, what is your fiscal year? Usually that's also outlined in your bylaws. That marries up to what is that accounting, your 990, depending again on the complexity, or your Sarbanes-Oxley for that organization. You will also see sometimes policies like conflict of interest, either process of amending, or indemnification in there as well. I've seen confidentiality in there as well. What I would share though is that specifically in the state of Florida, what we're finding is not only is conflict of interest in the bylaws, but it is a required policy that must be signed annually by board members. So I have also seen this as a separate document re-signed should the organization be audited. Just something to consider. And I'm sure Ron will chime in on that. Any amendments, of course, could be attached to bylaws as the organization progresses or becomes more sophisticated in its operations. And then, of course, any relevant provisions that are tax exempt if that is part of your bylaws. So some of those more specific examples where I see, I think, shift over time, depending on the size of the organization, the complexity of the organization, maybe how large the board is, are those specific responsibilities, the roles, if you will, of those officers, their terms, how the election procedures. What I could say about the current terms that we're seeing a trend, not saying you have to use this, but most of the organizations, I would say, particularly in the last 3 years, are looking at three-year terms. You don't have to go along that. I just wanted to share with you somewhat of the industry standard we're seeing for a couple reasons. Number one, to have some longevity in those directors and officer positions. It's sort of swinging back the other way where the position of chair or vice chair is someone that has a greater knowledge of the board versus at the end of the term, who wants to be president, right? They want somebody that has that history. And so the three-year terms allows for a movement, if you will, from the committee level to those officer and directors positions. And so that there really are individuals that are part of those officers, those key positions that have a history with the organization. Something key that I'd love for Ron to also chime in on from a legal perspective that I know we worked with on boards is how they're going to be held and how you're going to be either voting or virtual. It's very important, and I don't mean to speak to under the sunshine type of boards, and we can speak to that if there's some questions along those lines, but not just the pandemic has pushed this, but do you have provisions in your bylaws that outline that you can vote virtually, you can vote via email? Those are things that really need to be put within the bylaws. If you are creating a board that is truly respective of just the state of Florida versus in just one county, I would encourage you to make sure that it's outlined in there how many days they have to review certain documents, but also what is going to be the custom for what constitutes as a meeting. It used to be in person, but as people are utilizing board matrix to make sure they have a more diverse board, they have a diverse mix of talents and so forth. And as they expand and grow, that they're having a board that really is a compository of who they serve. So that's something to look at as well. And then, of course, establishing your quorum, right? There's many ways to do that, whether it's the majority or a minimum to allow things to move forward. So you don't really have a board that is rubber stamping, if you will, that a board member can't in hindsight look back and go, you know, I really wasn't aware or participate in that. And so that there can really be some hefty discussion about the future vision of the organization. Not that you couldn't address some of those issues in the meeting minutes and open it up for discussion, but what does that look like in terms of really being inclusive for creating a quorum? And then how the nonprofit can be dissolved. You will most likely always find that somewhere in your bylaws, whether it's by vote of the membership, whether it is by vote of the board. But there, should you ever have to do that, and maybe Ron, you can speak to not only dissolved, unfortunately, we're seeing organizations not only in 2008, but this year having to be dissolved because they're not financially sustainable or solvent. But do they need to either be dissolved in a sense because maybe there's a new entity coming into play? So with that, I wanted to just hand it over to Ron, maybe if there's any finer points you want to touch on there from a legal perspective, Ron, and then we do have a question.
Sure. Well, why don't we do this, Michelle? Why don't we take the question first, because it might anticipate something I would say, and then I could backfill with a few other comments.
Sure. One was a comment, and then we've got a question. So one was regarding the term limit. So after the three-year terms, is there usually a year off? Are they permitted to come back on? I'll just share my experience, Ron. Please feel to chime in when I'm done. But I have seen it done a couple ways. If it's just one board, for example, of directors, yes, they're usually permitted to come back on. I've also seen if you wanted to bless and release, let's say in a nice way, maybe there is a different board, maybe it's an emeritus board, maybe it is an advisory board that might be used in a way to sunset board members. And I think the third example might be is if you are an organization that has a board and then maybe a separate fundraising or foundation board, it could be that when their terms are up on the governing board, that they might be allowed to serve on the foundation board. And sometimes I've seen board members move to a foundation board, serve there, and then maybe come back on. And then, so Ron, any comments on that comment?
Yeah, so it's important to understand fully the distinction between a term and a term limit. And you could have a 3-year term, or you could have a 1-term term limit for that 3 years. And the reason that that's super important is term limits have kind of become in vogue a little bit, but I think they may be overused in certain circumstances, and they do present situations that I've seen clients kind of twist and contort to try to then get around their own term limits. And so the example I would give you is if you have a really fully engaged board member who's very connected and is making $1 million a year contribution to your organization, do you want to tell that person, no, you can't be on the board anymore, and potentially lose their engagement and lose their $1 million a year? Most organizations would say no. In some organizations, what I've seen them do is create an emeritus type category or create different types of terms and try to move the person around and really sort of circumvent their own governing document to make exception for the individual. So what I would suggest to any organization is to think about whether you need term limits as opposed to terms, and playing that out practically. If you have 3-year terms, at the end of the term, a nominating committee would have to re-nominate the person, and they would have to be re-elected to the board. It's a little bit difficult if somebody says, I want to continue on the board, but they've not been productive, they've not given up their time, treasures, or talents to say to them, sorry, there's not a place for you on the board anymore, we're not re-electing you. But you have that natural opportunity. If the organization, the nominating committee, and the board doesn't have the fortitude to make that tough decision, the term limit is an easy way to say to the person, sorry, we love you, we'd love to have you on, but you can't do it. We'd have to amend our governing documents. But it also puts the organization in that circumstance where they might have to kick somebody off the board, have them sit out, for instance, for a year. Another mechanism I've seen is that committees don't have to always be board members on the committee. There can be non-board member committee members. So you can, for instance, add that board member who's rotating off to your finance committee or something like that for a year, and keep them engaged without them being an official board member. But I would suggest to everyone to give very careful consideration to whether term limits are right for your organization. And if not, maybe just have terms and a robust nomination process that can help manage that circumstance.
Thank you, Ron. And this next question, I'm actually going to hand to you because, from the legal perspective, but we have a question. Any suggested wording for virtual meetings and voting?
Yes, so it's a good question. And I think typically you would want the wording to be something to the effect of any person who participates in a meeting whereby they can be heard and hear simultaneously with the other members of the meeting would be considered present for purposes of quorum. So the idea being that there's no delay in the person's participation, whether it be by video or telephonic communication, they're actively able to hear and be heard at real time with the other members of the committee. They should be counted for quorum. That's very typical today. What I've seen organizations get themselves in trouble with is when they don't have a provision, when the quorum requirement or the attendance requirement says present in person, and they allow somebody to participate by phone, and another board member wants to challenge the action of the board, they can later claim that that person's vote didn't count because they weren't under the governing documents participating in a way that was required. So again, the question I think was specific language, and I'd have to see it in writing and kind of make sure it's down. But the concept being to have it be by telephonic or video means in a way that the individual can hear and be heard real time with the other participants of the meeting would qualify them for being present at the meeting and being counted toward quorum.
Okay. Thank you. And before we move on to the next slide, Ron, were there anything that you wanted to just touch on in this slide? Any finer points?
Yeah, a whole bunch of them. There's each of these has pitfalls ahead of them, but I know we've got the interest of time. I'll give you one, for instance, right? Something like quorum. It's easy for an organization to say quorum could be 50% of the members of the board. It sounds nice and reasonable. You have to think about how that plays out in certain circumstances and just make sure that you have a minimum number or that you have other provisions in your governing documents that require certain actions to have a higher vote of the organization. So as a for instance, if you have 9 board members and you say that a quorum is 50% and then the particular action takes a majority vote, that means that 3 of the 9 people can decide the course of the organization, because you could have 5 people show up at the meeting, which makes a quorum, and a majority of those 5 is 3. And if you don't specify that dissolving the corporation requires supermajority vote or 75% of the sitting board members or something like that, you could have the company dissolved by 3 of the 9 individuals of the organization. And over the course of my 25 years of practice, I have seen many, many instances where 3 or 4 members of a larger board get disenfranchised with the direction of the company and are a little bit rogue and want to do certain things. So the idea with these provisions is to make sure you're protecting against them. It also, for instance, in committees, which are typically smaller than the full board, if you did the same thing and you had a 4-person committee and 51% would be 3 of the people, and then you had a majority vote, which would be 2 people, you could have 2 people of the entire board, even if the board is a 25-person board, take action. And if it's the finance committee and the finance committee chooses the audit firm, 2 people out of 25 could fire the audit firm and hire a different audit firm, which might not be the will of the company overall. So it's using the quorum as an example. Each of these has some pitfalls that you would want to give careful consideration to how they play out. It's not just the words on the page, it's practically how it's going to affect your organization. And I think, Michelle, on the next page, there's a few of those things that we're highlighting, so maybe we can go over here. So one is reserve powers of the board, and this is fairly critical because you don't want your board of directors engaged in activities that are beyond their scope in the governance structure, meaning they're not to be running the day-to-day operations of the corporation. That's the role of the CEO and management. And if there's any issue that I see come up more often than not that causes frustration between board and management, it's the line between what the board's role is and what the management's role is. So what you do want to do is be clear that the CEO of the organization, the executive director of the organization, has the authority to run the day-to-day operations. And one way to do that is vest in them the broad authority to run the day-to-day operations of the company, and then reserve out certain things for the board. And I've given a little bit of a menu here, like the board should have the responsibility for amending the governing documents, the approval of the operating and capital budgets of the organization that are presented by management should be vested in the board. The CEO's hiring and evaluation and termination should be vested in the board. The mission shouldn't be changed other than by vote of the board. I would suggest that the audit firm and the general counsel should be chosen by the board. Ultimately, those 2 report to the board as a whole. And appointing officers and electing the directors. And there could be other items. For instance, it's a frequent provision to say any kind of expenditure outside of budget over a certain dollar amount needs to be approved by the board, giving the CEO the authority to make some decisions outside of budget, but they would be capped at a certain amount. this, again, this kind of structure sets up where the board's role is on policy and where the management's role is on operationalizing the day-to-day activities of the company. So term limits, and we talked a little bit about that already, so I won't belabor that, and staggering of the terms are considerations that need to be carefully taken into consideration. Staggering of terms is sort of important because you don't want all of your board members to have a 3-year term that all expire at the same time with term limits. So then you'll have 9 new board members who come in at once. It's very hard to keep continuity of a company when you have the entire board who has no historical knowledge for obvious reasons. And then committee structure is super important too. Michelle mentioned the board meeting schedule. If you have a large board, for instance, and they're comprised of some high-level, top-level individuals who you have for various reasons, it may be their connectivity in the community, it may be their financial contributions, it may be that you just want that person for one call a year they can make that can really help the organization. They may not want to be involved in all of the trappings of setting policy and meeting once a month or once every other month. You can delegate then to an executive committee who has more pervasive authority on behalf of the board to make decisions in between the board meetings. And then depending on the size of the organization, I typically see a finance committee, a governance committee, and then some committees that might be specific to the corporation. So if it's a organization that's charitable in nature and doesn't have its own fundraising arm, fundraising subsidiary, there might be a committee, for instance, just dedicated to fundraising. And obviously I can go on and on here, Michelle, but in the interest of time, might make sense to go on, giving you the idea that having bylaws in place, the words on a page are a check the box type of action, but what they really mean is going to drive whether you have a healthy functioning organization or not. And having facilitated discussion by someone like Michelle from a strategic perspective on these types of issues is super important so that you don't end up in a situation where you end up in trouble. And I'll give you one quick anecdotal. For instance, I represent a company that I act as their outside general counsel to, and they did not have a robust governance structure related to nominations. They did not have a nominating committee. Their process was just, we'll get to the annual meeting and entertain who wants to be an officer next year and vote on it. And for whatever reason, they decided in their governing documents many years ago that they would vote by secret ballot. So it wasn't an aye or nay or a raise of hands. It was you write it on a piece of paper. We got into their annual board meeting and the chair was up for rotation because of a term limit. And it was a tie vote between 2 individuals. And so obviously the tension in the room was high, and they looked at me in council and they said, well, what happens? And I said, well, the current chair stays in their place until their successor is duly elected. So we don't have a duly elected successor. I suggest we vote again. We voted 4 times and it was a tie each time. Obviously these 2 camps in the room became very tense. And the 2 individuals, I suggested that they take a recess and have some discussion amongst the individuals in the camps. And after about an hour on this one issue, we elected a chair, and it was a situation that didn't need to be tense. That was, had they had a nominating committee that could have vetted and worked that out, they could have avoided that kind of tension. So thinking through those things in advance will alleviate some very awkward situations and maybe bad governance of an organization.
Ron, could you speak to either your thoughts or pros or cons of having the CEO, executive director, president, whatever terminology it is, as a voting member? Some nonprofits that I work with, they don't do that. Some of them, they do. And I just didn't know if you wanted to maybe share your thoughts from a legal perspective. What would be some of the pros or what would be some of the cons, particularly because we have some executive directors on this call?
Yep. So clearly in the for-profit setting, it's more typical than not to have a CEO be a board member. That's frequently, though, because the CEO is also a shareholder and owner of the company and is a peer of the other board members, and they're collecting themselves as a board to collaboratively work through the direction of the company, and they're all typically owners or owner appointed individuals. In my experience, it's less frequent in the not-for-profit setting to have the CEO be a voting member of the board, as opposed to being staff of the board. It does happen from time to time. I've seen organizations do that. But in my experience, because the CEO reports to the board, and essentially the board is the boss of the CEO, it creates some awkward circumstance. And frequently what I've seen is boards do go into executive session, meaning that they go into a session where no paid staff of the organization are in the meeting, which is not a clandestine thing. And the phrase comes from the old days of the US Senate, where they would meet outside the presence of the president in a closed door session to talk about issues that might directly involve the president. In the corporate context, it's meeting without the CEO. Clearly, if you're talking about CEO compensation, you might not want the CEO in the room, or there might be, for instance, an allegation, a whistleblower type allegation that's come to the board. The board would need to talk about that outside the presence of the CEO. So although not prohibited, clearly the CEO should be at the board meetings and present at the board meetings. The chair runs the meeting, but the CEO should be front and center and even drive the agenda with the chair. But by way of votes, it's less typical. And frankly, I think it gives the CEO some cover. If, for instance, the organization is going to finance a transaction or borrow money, the CEO clearly is presenting a recommendation to do that. But to be able to say, I presented that decision to an independent board of directors who are not paid by the company, and they approved the decision without me voting on it, lends more strength to the decision and gives the CEO cover, if you will, that they didn't make that decision for any conflicted personal reasons on how it might affect their ability to make payroll or their bonus that year or anything like that.
Thank you for clarifying that. So our last slide, and then we'll open up to any final questions. We've talked about a few of these with each slide, but a couple I wanted to point out, maybe some ways to avoid some of these pitfalls, sort of a checklist, if you will, that we've addressed. But one of the ones I wanted to talk about was populating your executive or governance committee with an accurate cross-section of your organization. So, you know, it's interesting to me because sometimes people say, well, we're going to nominate people because terms are up, as you mentioned, it's time to do that. But as we all know, or those that really try from a best practices standpoint, we should be nominating year round. But to go along with that, if you're not already creating a board matrix that demonstrates the current composition of your board, so that you can foresee where will be some of those talents that we're going to need moving forward. Could be legal expertise, it could be finance expertise, it could be real estate expertise. But that is something that I'm always amazed at as the organization organically grows, of how board members came to be on the board. That's starting to shift and change, and certain things drive that. Maybe there's not a succession plan when the CEO leaves, maybe because they did not think about their terms, for example, and there's a mass exodus. But just something to think about in looking at those terms is also looking at a good cross-section of your organization and what they need at the time. And so one of the things I always share with organizations is, you might be in the founding stage, you might be in the development, growth, crisis, restructuring, you could be dissolving. All of those phases require a different type of talent. And so to definitely, you know, have bylaws that would reflect that, or have committees that would reflect that. So make sure that you're populating committee with a good cross-section of your organization. Obviously a hot topic right now we won't get into today, but this has come up in some of our other webinars, is diversity or inclusion, and where I'm all for an inclusive board, whether that be ages, ethnicity, race, but have a board that is representative of the mission that you serve. I think that's very important. So where I am an advocate for that, I would also say that if your organization is specifically serving a certain cross-section of the population, by all means have that, but not force the issue just to say we have a diverse board. And I think that comes up a lot, particularly also with the different generational needs across the board as well. Another point I wanted to touch on here is making sure that your purpose reflects the organization today. Just don't be scared to address or change the bylaws, as Ron suggested, every other year. Tasking a committee to look at that, whether it's the executive or governance committee, or if you don't have those set up yet, a task force, but making sure that it really is in alignment with how you're doing business, how you're functioning as an organization. Find so many organizations that they're so scared to look at the mission again, the vision, the values, and change their purpose. Almost like they don't want to really look at the articles, or they don't want to look at the bylaws and revisit them as if they're etched in stone. And so make sure that you're becoming comfortable with that, and that you're having education at your board meetings about what that means, so that it is a fluid document. It is something that can grow as the organization grows. And then, of course, looking at your committee composition. This is just something I want to drive home. One of the pitfalls that I see in a lot of the bylaws is they stock it with every particular type of committee. And I want to caution you against that, because it used to be that there were every type of committee in there when the board might have been functioning on the staff work. And that has been moved away. When the trust is building with the CEO, or there's operational functions, that's really entrusted to the CEO and the staff. And so make sure when you're looking at your committee composition, whether you're setting it up for the first time, or whether you're thinking about what do we need to take out, ask yourself if this committee really needs to be a standing committee and cited in the bylaws, versus one that can be an ad hoc committee, so that you're not having to amend your bylaws. So that is something that's always interesting to me. So definitely look at your committee composition, and don't pigeonhole yourself, because it's one thing to manage your board, it's another thing to try to manage and activate and engage your committees. So with that, what I'd like to do is just share with you some of the upcoming virtual training. I want to make sure that we're ending on time. This is on our website. We have some really incredible sessions that are coming up with other speakers as well. But I do want to take a pause and see if there's any questions at this time. I have you off mute to see if there's any questions that have not been answered. None at this time. So if anything comes to mind, please feel free. You can reach out to either myself or Ron if there's something specific. We will definitely make this available to you, not only the video, but also the slides if this is something that you need. And I just really want to thank you all for sharing time with us today. We hope that this was helpful. We have a survey that will follow up in a day or two. And Ron, just any parting words? Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your expertise.
Oh, absolutely, my pleasure. And Michelle, I got a chance to look at the organizations that were in attendance today, and there are some extraordinary missions. So I just wanted to say thank you to those people who are attending today for the hard work that you're doing on a day in and day out basis. Those missions are vital to this community, to this region. And thank you. And if there's anything we can do to help you serve those missions, please feel free to reach out to us.
Thank you so much. Y'all have a great day.
Bye-bye.